point to one thing, another thing, and say, if we fix this, we're going to be better off? Or is it more complicated?
No, I think it's way more complicated.
Yeah.
I'm hopeful that, since Saturday, we've had a little more time. We've had a lot of short preps, a lot of traveling. I don't think that's the only reason, but, we were not, I think, as in sync as we were. And I'm hopeful that, we've been able to go back to some of the basic things that we needed to fix. And I think when you look at everything in its entirety, you got to say, well, all right, let's start with the defense. Okay, it's transition, it's rebounding, it's on the ball, it's ball screen defense, it's help recovery, it's being in the gaps. I mean, all of those things. And we have drills, and whether it's 2-on-2, 3-on-3, 4-on-4, 5-on-5. Kind of like the beginning of practice. Back in September. And then, okay, it's not just defense; it's offense. So where we have to work on offense, whether it be our motion game, our transition game, our set plays. Then you shift to zone. Both man or both defensively and offensively, and then what you're looking for is the correct energy level with which to attack all of those things we just mentioned. So, yesterday we had a terrific practice in that regard. So we'll try to turn around and do the same thing today, and then leave tomorrow and have one more before we play Thursday.
On defense, when you look at kind of the on-ball situations, in some cases, is it confusion, is it lack of communication, or is it just too broad to just generalize on one of those?
Well, I think it's a lot of things. Okay, it could be confusion based on they're running a particular action that the guys didn't see it right away. Okay, it was a switch situation. They recognized it was a switch situation, but if you recognize that a second or a second and a half late, the shot's gone. Now, if the shot misses, you don't think anything of it. But if the shot goes in, and it's like, well, that's bad defense. And, technically, if we had been a little sharper for that second and a half, maybe they would have missed it. So sometimes it's that. Sometimes it's, like I said the other night, a little bit more fatigue. I played a couple of guys a little bit less than I normally do. Played a couple of guys a little bit more than I normally do. So it could be that. So it's not like you're saying, okay, there's one thing. No, there's not one thing. It's collective. And I think the encouraging thing for us is this particular team has played excellent defense this year. And that's what our goal is, to go back and play that kind of defense again.
You played, after playing arguably your best game against Michigan, played one game in 13 days. Then you play, so you couldn't sustain that momentum. Then you play 5 games in 16 days when things went a little south. Is that a factor momentum-wise and when you play the games?
I think that, Rick, coupled with, there were a lot of road trips there, a lot of 2 a.m. arrivals, whether it be on the road or back here. So I think there's no question that had something to do with it. So that's why I thought, Sunday being an off day, day of rest, hard day of practice yesterday, hard day of practice today, tomorrow we obviously won't go as hard. And we'll be ready to go Thursday.
Coach, do you get the sense your players are excited to get a fresh start in the tournament situation?
I would say this, anytime you have an opportunity to play in an event of this caliber, I think that's going to make everybody pretty excited. As it relates to what happened the previous game, the previous 5 games, the previous 15 games, I don't think that matters.
What do you do to keep up morale and confidence for the team?
I don't view myself as a guy who has to pick up morale or, you know, bring them down from a pedestal. I mean, we just coach, you know, we stay like this. You know, I don't think, I think folks who think that coaches have these unbelievable speeches to get everybody revved, I think that's foolish. It doesn't happen. You know, it just doesn't. You look at this season in terms of the length of it and the intensity of the journey, and you prepare. And that's how you get ready to play a team like Northwestern. You know, we prepare. That's exactly what they're doing for us. You know, we played them twice. You know, we've seen each other play a million times because you watch other teams. Get ready.
You beat this team by, you know, over 20 points both times. What is the inherent challenge for you to not get a team to overlook a team when you play them a third time?
I don't think that our guys have ever done that. You know, I think we're mature enough to know and understand. I think we're respectful of that program. We've had some very difficult games with them. Everybody knows how good Drew Crawford is. They're also intelligent enough to recognize when guys are making strides. Like you look at a guy like Ola. Look at him last year. Look at him now. Two different players. I mean, he's really a guy that you say he can get 20 and 10 if you don't play him right, if you don't work hard or harder than he does. Look at a guy like Trey Demps, who a year ago was just kind of a microwave off the bench. This year he established himself as one of the premier players in our league. Great late game shot maker. So now you start putting those pieces together, you know, with a guy like Lumpkin or Abrahamson, and they go on the road and they beat Purdue. They won a ton of road games this year in our league, and we all know how hard that is. They've got a new coach, an excellent coach, and Chris Collins, and he's employed a system that's been successful. So, you know, we recognize what we're up against.
And when you get to, it's this late in the season that you're talking about the middle of March, is it almost to the point where, I mean, there's only so much you can say, and that it's almost up to the kids to find it within themselves to fix the things?
I think there's a certain element of truth to that,
Yeah.
but at the same time, it's up to us to put the game plan together. You know, in terms of energy level, attention to detail, you know, they got to be revved up, and they got to play through their mistakes, and they got to be over toward the ball. They got to be up toward the ball. They got to be in their stance. You know, stay in their stance. Because if you stand up and you relax, this team's going to carve you up. The players and the system will carve us up. So hopefully, you know, we'll know and understand that. And I think we're mature enough, and we've been through it. I think we'll have the right attitude there.
You've had, I think, the same record, both overall and conference record going in the tournament. Granted, this season's Big Ten schedule was probably tougher than last year's, but how does this 2 seasons feel different in your mind?
Dramatically different. I think, Rick, anytime you have a different team and you play a different schedule, it just has a different feel to it. You know, the fact that we ended up with identical records, I think, is just a coincidence in that sense. But we clearly challenged ourselves with a much more difficult non-conference schedule. We were handed a substantially more competitive conference schedule. And, you know, I think we handled it well. And, you always look back and say, well, boy, you know, obviously we didn't want to lose 5 of our last 6. And we lost some games that we could have won, but there's not a coach in the country, there's not a player in the country who doesn't look back at this point and say, wow, you know, if we could have just had that one and that one. And that's just human nature, I think.
After the game, you mentioned your team might be a little fragile. Were you talking late game situations? How do you address that with your team?
I wasn't necessarily talking about late game situations. I was just, you know, because our biggest problem in that game was the first 8 minutes. You know, I think in many respects, things weren't coming as easy. You know, we got a couple guys that are struggling based on what they were doing a month ago. Puts more pressure on other guys, and they're trying to come through, and then if they miss, then there's more pressure on them. It just was all culminating in the team that looked one way a month ago and looked differently a month later. You know, I think back to that particular game you're referring to, and like the two turnovers late, the one by Marble, the one by White, is very uncharacteristic. And I think those two in particular were feeling a lot of pressure to come through for our team under difficult circumstances, based on the fact that we weren't making as many shots. We did have a few more turnovers than we had been having. And those are areas, go back to the very first question of the day, that we have to address. You know, it's not all going to fall on two guys. You know, we've got to cut back on our turnovers. We've got to do a better job of rebounding the ball. And we were a dominant rebounding team. Now we're a pretty good rebounding. You know, we're not as dominant as we've been. So, well, why is that? Well, it could be a couple different reasons. Number one, I've downshifted and played a smaller lineup more recently. Why? Well, to match up to the opposition perhaps, or to create more offense, you know, depending upon the game, the circumstances, time to score, etc.
Does Thursday at all feel like a must-win to take away any doubts that the selection committee could have come
No, I
Sunday?
don't look at anything like that, no.
Coach, I know you've talked to a lot of NBA people. Do you think Devin will be drafted? Is that kind of the feeling you're
He's
getting?
getting drafted. Yeah, I think it's just a matter of if it's the first round or early second.
He, do you think his ability to shoot from the perimeter as much as anything has helped his stock? Or is it his ball handling? What do you think his...
Well, I think his ability to consistently score is something that they're always going to want to see in a player at his position. Okay, I think that's safe to say. After that, I think they love a number of things about him. Number one, he can play more than one position. He's clearly can play the one. You know, when you're 6'6" and you can play the one, that's going to be huge. He can guard a 1-2-3. That's big because they do a lot of switching. They've been able to ascertain that he's incredibly cerebral. You know, the playbooks in the NBA are very complex. You got to be able to remember it, know it inside and out. He's got great feel for how to play the game. He plays the game with no panic. You know, and he's a guy that puts the time in the off season and gets himself ready. And that's critical because you got to be able to play 82 games. And so there's so much more that they're looking at, you know, in terms of making an investment in him. And as you analyze it, you know, he grades out really highly in all of those areas. So when you're making a decision as to whether I take this guy or another guy, you know, you might take another guy who's, you know, oh, he's a great rebounder, or he's a great three-point shooter. But when you look at Devin Marble, he's terrific in every aspect of the game. And you can put him in and pretty much do anything for you. And those guys are really valuable. And ultimately, franchises want to win games. And that's what he is a winning player.
In the last three games at halftime, you've had leads, and then the other teams come out with a big run. Michigan State 9-0, Purdue 12-2, even Illinois.
The 9-0 run there was other factors involved.
Mm-hmm. But as far as the points themselves, I mean, is there anything that you could draw as any kind of conclusion, something that's common among the three? Not coming.
Michigan State won out.
Okay.
Start there. So you're talking about Illinois and
Purdue.
The Purdue situation was disappointing from where I sit, because they scored 6 of the first 7 possessions, as I recall. When you have a 13-point lead, you don't want that to happen. What was disappointing about that in particular was, as they were going 6 for 7, our offense was a little sideways. Now, we had a couple clean looks at it. They didn't go in. That magnified everything. Fortunately, we had plenty of time to still get the victory. Our lead against Illinois was much smaller. And so, obviously, you don't want them to come out and hit 2 threes, but they hit 2 threes. I don't think, you can't overanalyze that. It'd be different if they had 5 threes, but they had 2 threes, and they were somewhat contested.
You guys can see the bracket and see who your second round opponent would be. Does that make it maybe even more of a challenge to get them to focus on Northwestern and take this one game at a time?
I honestly don't think it matters at all.
Coach, I know without being able to get into specifics because you're not allowed to with recruiting, but it seems like a couple big city commitments, you can't speak to this, but do you like, in the past, when you've recruited players, do you like big city players? Do they bring a nuance, a feel for the game that maybe you don't get with other players?
I would answer that question this way. I'm being completely honest with you, Rick. It doesn't matter to me where they're from. Okay? If they're from the city and I think they can really play and I think they can help us, then we'll recruit them. If they're from the